everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be unpacking Narcissistic Personality Disorder, or NPD for short. And our guide for this journey is going to be this really interesting university-level psychology textbook. It explores all sorts of personality disorders.
It's definitely a topic that people are curious about.
Oh, for sure. But, before we get too deep into it, I think it's important to say that, our goal here isn't to start labeling people. It's more about just understanding NPD better.
Yeah.
Where it comes from and how it's viewed and treated. So maybe a good place to start would be with the myth that actually gave NPD its name. The Greek myth of Narcissus, the guy who fell in love with his own reflection.
Yeah, that's a classic story of self-infatuation.
Yeah.
But NPD is a lot more complex than just, being vain or self-absorbed. It's a clinically diagnosed personality disorder with a very specific set of criteria. It's not just a casual label.
Okay, so how do psychologists actually go about diagnosing someone with NPD then? Our textbook mentions the DSM-IVTR criteria.
All right, so the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is basically like the Bible for mental health professionals. It outlines all the criteria for diagnosing all different kinds of mental health conditions, including NPD.
So what are we talking about here? 9 criteria, but someone needs to meet at least 5 for a diagnosis. It's not just about taking too many selfies, right?
Right. No, definitely not. Think about someone who's constantly name-dropping celebrities or bragging about all their connections. That hints at a need to be associated with special people, or someone who expects special treatment at a restaurant, even though they haven't really earned it. That shows a sense of entitlement.
Okay, yeah, those examples are really helpful to kind of bring those criteria to life. But our source also points out that NPD often kind of masks this deeper level of insecurity and fragility. That's kind of surprising, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. You see, on the outside, a narcissist might project this image of confidence and superiority, but underneath it all, there's often this very vulnerable sense of self.
So how does that hidden vulnerability play out then?
Well, it really impacts their relationships.
Yeah.
Individuals with NPD often struggle to empathize with others, so they might end up exploiting people around them for their own personal gain. And that constant need for admiration can really be exhausting for everyone else.
It's like they're always seeking validation from the outside world, but never really quite feeling fulfilled.
Exactly. Now imagine being their therapist.
Oh, wow. That sounds like it could be a challenge.
It definitely is. Therapists often encounter a lot of resistance from patients with NPD. They might be reluctant to even admit that they have a problem, or they might devalue the therapist's expertise.
So how do therapists even begin to approach treatment with all these complexities? And where does NPD even come from in the first place? Like, is it nature? Is it nurture? Are people born with this? Or did their life experiences kind of shape it?
Ah, yes. The classic nature versus nurture debate. Well, let's look at some of the theories.
Okay, I'm ready for a good theoretical deep dive.
Okay, so some researchers, like Kohut, for example, they believe that early childhood experiences are really crucial in shaping narcissistic tendencies.
So how would that work?
Well, think about a child who's constantly showered with praise, even for mediocre achievements.
Yeah.
Kohut might say that this could lead to an inflated sense of self.
Yeah.
Because they never really learn how to deal with criticism or setbacks.
But isn't a healthy dose of praise good for kids?
Yeah.
Where's the line between encouragement and, creating a little narcissist?
Yeah, that's where things get interesting. See, another prominent researcher, Kernberg, he offers a contrasting perspective. He suggests that NPD might actually develop as kind of a defense mechanism against having cold or unempathetic parents.
Wait, so if a child is neglected, wouldn't they develop low self-esteem instead of narcissism? How does that lead to this grandiose self-image?
That's a really good question. So Kernberg's theory is that the child, because they're starved for love and validation, they basically construct this grandiose persona to shield themselves from those feelings of worthlessness or being unloved.
Yeah. So in both cases, the child's environment seems to play a crucial role, whether it's through too much praise or emotional neglect. Okay, that's starting to make a little more sense.
And there's another layer to consider. Our source highlights this sociologist, Christopher Lasch, and his idea of a culture of narcissism. So could societal pressures also be contributing to how common NPD is?
That's an interesting thought. I mean, think about it. You can't scroll through social media these days without seeing people showing off their perfect lives. It's like everyone's in this competition.
Exactly. So Lasch argued that our culture's emphasis on individualism, success, and self-promotion might be creating this environment where narcissistic traits can really flourish.
So are we all becoming a little narcissistic then?
That's something to ponder, isn't it? Is it possible that all this pressure to achieve, to stand out, to present this perfect image, is pushing all of us towards being more narcissistic?
Whoa. That is a thought-provoking question. And on that note, I think we're going to take a little pause here, and when we come back, we'll dive into another fascinating aspect of NPD. It's subtypes. All right, deep divers, welcome back. So before the break, we left off on this kind of cliffhanger. We were about to get into NPD subtypes, and I'm really ready to unpack those further. So hit me with the insights.
Okay, so let's break it down. Remember Theodore Millon? He was a big personality researcher.
Yeah.
And he proposed these 5 distinct subtypes of NPD, and some of these are pretty striking.
Okay, you've got me intrigued. So what makes each subtype unique?
Well, Millon's subtypes highlight all these different ways that NPD can actually show up in real life.
Yeah.
So for example, you've got the unprincipled narcissist, and this subtype often combines classic narcissistic traits with antisocial tendencies. So basically they can be very manipulative, and they might exploit others for their own gain.
Yeah.
Often without any remorse.
Whoa. Okay, so are they even aware then of the harm that they're causing?
That's the tricky part. Their lack of empathy makes it really hard for them to recognize or care about the impact they're having on other people. They're really driven by their own needs and desires, and they'll often disregard rules or social norms to get what they want.
So it's not just about feeling superior then. There's this element of disregard for other people's well-being. What about the other subtypes? You mentioned the amorous narcissist earlier.
Right. This subtype combines NPD with what we call histrionic features.
Yeah.
So basically they crave attention and admiration. They often use their charm or their physical appearance to captivate people. They can be very dramatic and emotionally expressive.
Yeah.
They really thrive on being the center of attention. It's almost like an actor on a stage.
Yeah, it's like they're always performing, always playing a role to get that validation. Okay, so are there any other subtypes that really stand out to you?
Well, there's the compensatory narcissist. Now, they might seem shy or self-effacing on the surface, but deep down, they have this intense need for recognition and admiration. They might constantly compare themselves to others, feeling envious or resentful of anyone who they think is more successful.
So it's like they're overcompensating for this hidden sense of inadequacy. Are these subtypes fixed categories then? Or can someone kind of shift between them over time?
It's a great question. It's not always super clear-cut. Remember, these subtypes are more like guidelines. They help us understand all the different ways that NPD can present. One person might show traits from multiple subtypes, or they might even change over time, depending on their experiences and the people they're interacting with.
It's just another reminder, I guess, that we're dealing with a complex disorder here. It's not just a simple checklist of symptoms.
Exactly. And speaking of complexity, let's zoom out for a sec and consider some of those societal factors that might be contributing to what some people see as a rise in narcissism.
You mentioned earlier the sociologist Christopher Lasch and his concept of a culture of narcissism. How does our modern society kind of play into this fostering of narcissistic tendencies?
Well, Lasch argued that our culture is really obsessed with individualism, with being successful, and with curating this perfect self-image. And this creates this environment where these narcissistic traits can really thrive. Think about it. We're bombarded with messages constantly telling us to be the best, stand out from the crowd, build your personal brand.
Yeah, that's true. You can't really escape it. And with social media, it's easier than ever to create this carefully crafted persona that projects success and happiness, even if that's not the reality.
Exactly. Social media has become this breeding ground for self-promotion and the constant pursuit of likes and followers, which feeds directly into that narcissistic need for external validation.
But is there a difference then between healthy self-confidence and what we would call like pathological narcissism? I mean, it's not necessarily bad to, celebrate your achievements or reward success, right?
Right. That's a really important distinction. Healthy self-confidence is about recognizing your strengths and your accomplishments, but also acknowledging your limitations and respecting other people. Narcissism, on the other hand, involves this really inflated sense of self-importance, a lack of empathy, and this constant need to be admired, often at the expense of other people.
So it's all about balance. It's okay to be proud of yourself without putting others down or needing that constant external validation.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the importance of self-awareness. We really need to be mindful of our own motivations and behaviors. Ask yourself, am I seeking attention or validation in a way that's crossing the line?
So this deep dive isn't just about diagnosing other people with NPD. It's about taking a look in the mirror And asking ourselves some tough questions, too.
Exactly. We all have some narcissistic tendencies to some extent. It's just part of being human. The key is recognizing when those tendencies are interfering with our relationships, with our own well-being, or our ability to function in a healthy way.
And if we do recognize those patterns, what can we do about it? Is there any hope for change?
Well, that's where therapy comes in. As we discussed earlier, psychotherapy can be really helpful in addressing narcissistic tendencies, but it is often a challenging process.
What makes it so challenging?
Well, for starters, there's often a lack of self-awareness, and there's resistance to treatment. But skilled therapists can help people with NPD to start developing a more realistic self-image. They can learn healthier coping mechanisms. And ultimately, they can build more fulfilling relationships that are based on genuine connection rather than that constant need for admiration.
So it's about shifting from that self-centered perspective to a more other-centered perspective.
Exactly. And this is where empathy becomes a crucial part of healing.
Empathy. But isn't a lack of empathy like one of the hallmarks of NPD? It seems almost contradictory.
Yeah, it seems that way. But therapists can actually help people with NPD to cultivate empathy.
Yeah.
You know, that ability to understand and share the feelings of other people.
That sounds like a pretty monumental task, considering that empathy is basically absent in a lot of cases of NPD.
It's definitely not easy.
Yeah.
But it's not impossible either. Therapists use a variety of techniques to try to cultivate empathy, like role-playing, perspective-taking exercises, and even mindfulness practices.
So it's like rewiring the brain, in a sense, to be more tuned in to the emotions and experiences of others. What about medication? Is there a magic pill for narcissism?
I wish it were that simple.
Huh.
Unfortunately, there's no medication, specifically for NPD. However, medications might be prescribed to address other conditions, like anxiety or depression, which can sometimes make those narcissistic tendencies even worse.
So it's about managing the symptoms while addressing the underlying personality disorder through therapy.
Exactly. And it's really important to remember that therapy is a journey. It's not a quick fix. It takes time and effort and a willingness to confront some uncomfortable truths about yourself.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion to slowly reveal the vulnerabilities and the insecurities that might be driving those narcissistic behaviors.
That's a great analogy. And as those layers are peeled back, there's a real opportunity for healing, for growth, and for developing more genuine connections with others.
Okay, so this has been really eye-opening. We've covered so much about NPD, the subtypes, the potential causes, and the complexities of treatment. But even with all this information, it feels like there's still more to uncover.
Yeah, you're right. Before we wrap up this section, there's one more really important aspect of NPD that we need to talk about. It's about the impact this disorder has on the people surrounding the narcissist.
That's a great point. We focused a lot on the individual with NPD, but what about the people in their lives? How are they affected?
It can be incredibly challenging for their partners, family members, friends, colleagues. They often end up bearing the brunt of the narcissist's behavior, and their experiences are often overlooked.
That makes sense. The constant need for admiration, the lack of empathy, those manipulative behaviors, it must really take a toll.
It absolutely does. And it's so important to remember that the people around the narcissist are not responsible for their behavior. They didn't cause it, and they can't cure it.
So what can they do then? Are they just supposed to endure the pain and hope things get better?
No, it's not about just enduring the pain. Setting boundaries is crucial. It's about protecting yourself from the emotional fallout of the narcissist's behavior.
What would those boundaries look like?
They could take a lot of different forms. It might involve limiting contact with the narcissist, refusing to engage in certain conversations, or even seeking professional help to cope with the stress.
So it's about self-preservation then. But isn't that a form of rejection? Won't the narcissist retaliate?
There's always that risk.
Yeah.
Narcissists don't usually respond well to boundaries or to what they perceive as criticism. But setting boundaries isn't about rejecting the person, it's about protecting yourself.
Yeah, it's like saying, I care about you, but I also care about myself, and I need to create some space to protect my own well-being.
Exactly. And sometimes setting boundaries can actually be a wake-up call for the narcissist. It might prompt them to get help, or at least reconsider their behavior.
It's like you're holding up a mirror and showing them the real impact of their actions on the people that they supposedly care about.
That's a great way to put it. But even with boundaries, it can be really tough for loved ones to navigate these relationships.
Absolutely. So what advice would you give then to people who are struggling to deal with a narcissist in their life?
Well, first and foremost, remember that you're not alone. It's so important to seek support,
Yeah.
whether it's through therapy, joining a support group, or just talking to people who understand what you're going through. Find a safe space to process your emotions, learn coping skills, and remember that you're not to blame.
So it's a combination of self-care and community support.
Exactly. Recognizing the signs of NPD in ourselves and in others is a good first step.
Yep.
But it's also important to understand how this disorder affects relationships and the need for support and boundaries to protect everyone involved.
Okay, deep divers. I think we've earned a little breather. This has been such an informative exploration of NPD. But we're not done yet. Stay tuned for the final installment of our deep dive.
All right, deep divers, welcome back. We're ready to embark on the final leg of our journey into the world of narcissistic personality disorder. So far, we've explored those diagnostic criteria, the different subtypes, and we even talked about how our culture might be playing a role. But I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the people who are on the front lines of this disorder. You know, the therapists who are working with people with NPD.
It's a really unique and challenging field. Treating NPD requires this really special skill set, a ton of patience, and a genuine commitment to helping people navigate all the complexities of this disorder.
I can only imagine. I mean, we've already talked about the resistance to treatment, the tendency to devalue the therapist. And, you know, those fragile egos. It sounds like therapists really have to walk a tightrope. Oh, it's definitely a very delicate balancing act. Building that therapeutic alliance with someone who has NPD can be incredibly difficult. Therapists have to be empathetic, but also firm, supportive, but challenging. And all the while, they need to maintain those clear boundaries and manage their own emotional responses too.
So it sounds emotional taxing, even for the therapist. How do they protect themselves then from getting caught up in all the manipulation or, you know, feeling personally attacked? I mean, it must be so tempting to just throw your hands up and say, I'm out of here.
Right. Yeah, it's not for the faint of heart. This is where experience comes in. Having that specialized training and getting ongoing supervision are all crucial. Therapists need to be able to recognize and manage what we call countertransference, basically those emotional reactions that can come up when you're interacting with a client.
Okay, so break that down for me. What does countertransference actually look like when you're dealing with someone with NPD?
Well, imagine a therapist who starts feeling resentful towards a client with NPD. It could be that the client's behavior is triggering some of the therapist's own unresolved issues. That would be countertransference.
So it's about recognizing your own baggage, so to speak, and not letting it interfere with the process.
Exactly. It's about maintaining that professional detachment while still being present and engaged with the client. And you also have to remember, there's this power dynamic at play. Someone with NPD might try to assert their dominance or control over the therapist. They might test boundaries and constantly seek validation.
So basically they're repeating the same patterns that they have in their other relationship.
Exactly. That's why it's so crucial for the therapist to maintain that clear therapeutic frame, setting those boundaries and consistently reinforcing the rules and expectations of the therapeutic relationship.
But it sounds like it takes a very specific kind of person to do this work effectively. What qualities do you think are most important?
Well, patience is definitely at the top of the list. Therapists need to be able to tolerate that slow pace of change, the setbacks, those times when it feels like you're not making any progress. They also need to have a very strong sense of self, unwavering confidence in their expertise, and an ability to stay calm and centered, even when they're being provoked.
It's almost like a Zen master meets a seasoned chess player. You need that inner peace and that strategic brilliance.
I love that analogy. But, you know, it's not all uphill battles and emotional landmines. There are actually some incredibly rewarding aspects to this work, too.
Okay, tell me about those moments. What's it like for a therapist when they see that breakthrough with the client?
Those are the moments that make it all worthwhile. When you see someone with NPD start to develop that self-awareness, when they finally acknowledge how their actions are affecting others, or when they make a real effort to change their behavior, those are huge victories.
It's like watching a flower bloom after it's been struggling to break through all the thorns.
It really is.
Yes.
And those changes, even small ones, can have this ripple effect. It creates a more positive experience, not just for the individual, but also for their family and friends. It can really transform lives.
So even though it's a challenging road, there's hope for people with NPD. They can change, they can heal, and they can build healthier relationships.
Absolutely. And speaking of journeys, I think we've reached our final destination in this deep dive into NPD.
Okay, I'm ready for that recap. Tie it all together for me.
Okay, let's rewind for a second. We started by debunking that myth that NPD is just about vanity or being self-absorbed. We looked at those 9 diagnostic criteria from the DSM, and we explored all those fascinating subtypes of NPD.
We also talked about the nature versus nurture debate, examining those early childhood experiences and how our society might be contributing to these narcissistic tendencies.
Right. And then we stepped into the therapist's office.
Yeah.
And got a glimpse into the challenges and rewards of treating this disorder. It takes a special kind of person to do this work.
It really does. This deep dive has been so thought-provoking. It's made me more aware of how those subtle narcissistic tendencies can show up in our own lives, especially in a culture that's always pushing self-promotion and the need for external validation.
Yeah, I think that's the power of a good deep dive. It's not just about learning new information. It's about sparking self-reflection, challenging our assumptions, and hopefully inspiring us to engage with the world in a more mindful and compassionate way.
So as we wrap up our exploration of NPD, I want to encourage all of our listeners to continue their own deep dives. Read more about it, reflect on your own experiences, and have those conversations with the people in your life.
And if you're feeling concerned, or if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to a mental health professional for guidance and support. Remember, knowledge is power, and understanding is always the first step towards healing and growth.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back